One quiet morning, I walked onto the edge of my property, feeling the sun warm my shoulders, and I asked myself a question I never thought I'd need to ask. Where am I really? Which lines on this map belong to me? Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because what I'm about to tell you might make you question the safety of your own backyard. I bought a piece of land outside the HOA. Just a small plot, peaceful, untouched, a real escape from the petty control of Granderson Estates. But within days, I realized peace comes at a price. They didn't like me owning land outside their little world. They didn't want someone crossing their invisible lines. And that's when the bulldozers arrived. I remember it vividly. Headlights slicing through the pre-dawn fog, the rumble of engines shaking the ground, and that familiar, arrogant voice, Karen Fraser's, shouting orders as if she owned the world. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, who had been pushing around her neighbors like chess pieces for decades, had decided that my property was hers to control. The audacity, the nerve, the absolute sense of entitlement. And yet, this wasn't about fences or hedges. It was about power, and she had forgotten one crucial detail. I don't back down. Not then. Not now. Before we dive deeper, let me set the scene. Granderson Estates isn't some sleepy little cul-de-sac. It's a fortress of conformity, a place where rules are enforced with whispered threats, where favors are distributed like currency, and where the HOA board's agenda runs on fear and intimidation. Karen was at the top, orchestrating every move. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. And now she had set her sights on me, a man who had dared to step outside the invisible boundary she so jealously guarded. I could see it in her eyes when she learned about my land purchase. Contempt. Pure, undiluted contempt. The first time I saw her private army, I didn't know what I was looking at. I thought maybe it was a construction crew, maybe someone clearing land legally. Then the dozer appeared, monstrous and mechanical, its blade poised to rip into the earth that I had legally purchased. And behind it, two men in cheap black windbreakers with private security, stenciled on their backs, their stance wide, their eyes challenging. I realized immediately, this was intimidation, pure and simple, and I knew I needed to respond with authority, not emotion. The thing about people like Karen is that they operate under the illusion of untouchability. They believe the rules bend for them, that the law is just a suggestion, that threats and fear are enough to bend reality in their favor. But that day, I decided to test that assumption. I picked up the phone and called the sheriff before even putting on my boots. My hands were steady, my voice calm, because I knew the law was on my side. The contrast between her frantic, entitled energy and my measured, prepared response was already setting the stage. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. Before we go any further, let me pause. Imagine standing on your own land, the sun barely above the horizon, and seeing the first blade of a bulldozer aimed at your property line. Your blood runs cold. But that's not even the half of it, because this was only the beginning. The audacity of Granderson Estates had a pattern, a rhythm, a method. Karen didn't just appear with machinery out of nowhere. She had been planning, scheming, and lining up allies for weeks, maybe months. And what she didn't know was that I had my own plan, built on meticulous preparation, legal knowledge, and the patience to wait for the right moment. I had learned early in life the value of observing. I had learned that control comes not from brute force, but from intelligence, from anticipating every move an opponent might make. And Karen, arrogant, reckless Karen, had left a trail of breadcrumbs. Every email she had sent, every call she had made, every document she thought no one would see was a thread I intended to follow. But first, she needed to step. And she had. My eyes traced the horizon. I could see the reflection of the headlights bouncing off the trees, the shadow of the bulldozer looming like a beast. And yet, despite the fear she tried to inspire, I felt a surge of clarity, a rush of certainty. This is my land. These are my boundaries. And the law, my knowledge of it, my preparation, was my shield. Karen's aggression was loud, visible, tangible, but it was also reckless. It was full of holes. She thought she was enforcing power. She was exposing vulnerability, and I was ready to exploit it. The first confrontation was electric. Karen, storming toward the street, silk pajamas flapping, her face a mask of fury, shouting and gesturing, and me, calm, collected, phone in hand, recording every movement, every word. "What is going on here?" she demanded. She had no idea that every scream, every accusation, every frantic motion was being captured. Every moment of her entitlement was now evidence. The irony, delicious and bitter, was that she thought intimidation would silence me, that she could steamroll reality with her self-assured rage. And yet, in her own performance, she was leaving the proof of her criminality for all the right eyes to see. Before we go any further, picture this. A line drawn clearly on a map. A boundary, simple, indisputable. On one side, me. On the other, Karen's illusions of control. She had bulldozers. I had law, evidence, and a plan. She had rage, I had clarity, and in moments like these, clarity wins. Every HOA meeting, every whispered threat, every attempt to manipulate the system, every assumed advantage, these were all just distractions. The real leverage, the true power, was preparation and patience. And here's where everything blew apart. The security guards thought they were intimidating me, that I would back down in fear. But what they didn't realize was that my fear was irrelevant. The law was my ally, the sheriff was on the line, and every camera, every recording, every document I had collected would prove my case before a single blade of earth was moved. Karen's power, built over years of controlling her little enclave, was nothing against the combination of evidence and patience. Her bluff, exposed, would crumble under scrutiny. By the time the first sirens echoed through the quiet street, the night had transformed. From an attempted intimidation to a spectacle of legal enforcement, everything she had counted on, arrogance, control, secrecy, was evaporating. Karen didn't know it yet, but she had triggered a chain reaction she couldn't stop. And I, standing firm on my land, phone in hand, calm and collected, realized something crucial. In the game of property, power, and control, preparation beats aggression every time. I wasn't always the guy standing calmly on his property, phone in hand, watching entitlement crumble under the weight of the law. I earned that position. It didn't come from luck. It came from years of discipline, experience, and knowing exactly how far to push and when to hold back. Before Granderson Estates and Karen Fraser's petty reign, I had spent over a decade serving in positions where precision, patience, and unwavering calm were non-negotiable. Military service had taught me the value of observation and timing. In those years, a single misstep could cost lives. In my world, hesitation wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Those lessons carried over into every corner of civilian life, though I hadn't realized it until now. I had transitioned into federal service after leaving active duty, moving into roles where bureaucracy and strategy dominated the landscape. I learned how systems operate when they are supposed to enforce rules fairly, and how easily those systems could be manipulated by those who understood human behavior better than the law. Karen Fraser, in all her arrogance, had no idea that her little HOA empire was just another system ripe for exposure. The same principles I had used to plan operations thousands of miles away were now tools I could apply to defend my land. It was ironic. She thought she was the predator, but in reality, she was about to become the case study in what happens when ego meets preparation. People often ask me why I got involved in my community in the first place. It wasn't for recognition, medals, or applause. It was because I value order, fairness, and respect for rules that protect everyone, not just the loudest or most entitled. I had watched neighbors quietly suffer under HOA harassment for years, paying dues that vanished into petty projects, personal favors, and inflated contracts that lined the pockets of a few. Watching that injustice simmer had planted a quiet seed of resolve in me. The day I bought land outside the HOA wasn't a rebellion. It was a return to the principle that property rights, law, and common decency matter, and I would defend them relentlessly. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because this part of the story isn't just about me. It's about standing up when the system is being abused, when the people tasked with fairness are actually working against it. My credibility mattered here. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a trained observer, an expert in procedure, and someone who understood the weight of every document, every line of law, every clause buried in bylaws meant to obscure rather than protect. Karen Fraser may have thought her authority was absolute, but she was about to learn that authority without knowledge is fragile. I still remember the evenings I spent poring over HOA documents, bylaws, meeting minutes, and county ordinances. While most residents ignored the paperwork, trusting in appearances and Karen's polished presentations, I read every line with a magnifying glass of scrutiny. My background had trained me to see patterns where others saw chaos. I noticed inconsistencies in budgets, discrepancies in approved contractors, and subtle manipulations of meeting votes that nobody else questioned. To me, it was all data. To Karen, it was just paperwork. That gap in perception was the leverage I needed. It wasn't just about law and documentation. It was about authority in action. Every neighbor who whispered complaints, every resident who muttered about harassment, became part of a larger puzzle. I talked to them subtly, gathering stories, cross-referencing them against my own observations. Patterns emerged: favoritism, intimidation, selective enforcement of rules, and, most importantly, a culture of fear that Karen Fraser had cultivated to maintain control. And here's the truth. Fear is a fragile weapon. Fear only works as long as people think you are untouchable. Once that illusion cracks, all the intimidation, all the shouting, all the power trips collapse like a house of cards. I drew strength from my understanding of human behavior. I could read a person like a blueprint, and Karen was no exception. She craved respect, feared exposure, and thrived on controlling narratives. Every time she rallied the board against some neighbor, issuing threats thinly disguised as procedural reminders, I saw the cracks in her strategy. Every time she overstepped, she was revealing herself, handing me evidence without realizing it. That's how I knew I could win. Not through brute force or counter-threats, but through meticulous, patient accumulation of facts, observation, and readiness to act. My family played a crucial role in this as well. Diane, my wife, understood the stakes immediately. She was a steadying presence, someone who could absorb the stress of daily harassment without cracking. Her calm energy allowed me to operate at full focus. Every plan, every phone call, every document review was strengthened by her support. She became my sounding board, my partner in analysis, and, when the moment came, a witness to the authority we would assert against Karen Fraser's reckless aggression. The combination of training, preparation, and support gave me confidence that even in the face of bluster, I would not falter. Before we go any further, let me emphasize this. Credibility isn't just earned by titles. It's earned by action, by showing up, by analyzing, by understanding the system better than anyone else in it. Karen Fraser may have had her HOA title, her polished speeches, her meticulously staged meetings, but she lacked one critical thing: the ability to foresee the consequences of her own arrogance. I did, and that advantage would prove decisive. It was during this period of preparation that I began quietly assembling my evidence strategy. Every email I could legally access, every meeting minute, every approved contractor invoice, and every informal resident complaint was cataloged. It wasn't just about proving wrongdoing, it was about creating a narrative so precise and undeniable that no argument, no manipulation, no bullying tactic could withstand it. My military and federal experience taught me the importance of redundancy. Copies were made, chains of custody were noted, and digital evidence was backed up multiple times. Karen's bluffing empire would soon collide with meticulous, systematic preparedness, and the collision would be spectacular. At night, I would stand on the porch of my property and imagine the confrontation that might come. It was never idle fantasy. It was mental rehearsal. Every scenario was considered: legal, physical, psychological, every variable accounted for. This wasn't paranoia. It was disciplined anticipation. When Karen Fraser and her private enforcers eventually moved, I would be ready. Every step I took, every precaution, every phone call was part of a plan designed to ensure that the first act of aggression would be met with undeniable authority, and the first hint of overreach from her would be her undoing. This is where my credibility intersected with power. Karen Fraser had influence over the HOA, but I had knowledge, preparation, and allies ready to enforce the law. Authority without execution is just noise. Knowledge without action is wasted. I had both, and when the moment arrived, it would allow me to turn a situation designed to intimidate me into an inescapable demonstration of accountability. Every sleepless night studying bylaws, every conversation with lawyers, every carefully collected piece of evidence became a brick in the wall that Karen Fraser would ultimately hit head first. By the time the first bulldozer rumbled onto my property, I was ready. Not anxious, not reactive, but confident. I had built authority from a lifetime of experience, verified by every law, document, and principle I had learned and applied. And most importantly, I had a moral clarity that Karen Fraser could never comprehend. She thrived on fear and entitlement. I thrived on justice, preparation, and the unshakable calm that comes from knowing you are right. And that is the difference between the bully and the man who stands his ground. From the very first HOA meeting I attended, it was clear that Granderson Estates wasn't a community association. It was a theater of control, and Karen Fraser was the director. The polished smiles, the polite nods, the scripted motions, all of it was designed to give the illusion of fairness, while the real work happened behind closed doors. I learned quickly that power here wasn't about rules. It was about perception, manipulation, and fear. Karen had created a system where every decision, every vote, every committee appointment was orchestrated to maintain her dominance. And most of the residents, unaware of the strings, played their roles faithfully. Karen's grip on the HOA board was absolute. She handpicked allies for positions of influence, board members who either shared her goals or were too intimidated to question her. Meetings were carefully staged. Public discussion was limited, while decisions were voted on in closed sessions that residents were technically allowed to request minutes for, but never actually received. When I pressed for clarity on certain votes, the official responses were vague, citing bylaws or confidentiality, but I could sense the underlying intent: control, concealment, and a subtle but unmistakable warning. Step out of line, and you would feel the consequences. Every budget line told a story: the landscaping funds, The maintenance allocations, even the small discretionary amounts that were supposed to improve community life, were redirected. Large contracts went to companies owned by friends or family members. Smaller contracts disappeared entirely. I noticed patterns that others didn't. Checks for legitimate services were paid promptly, but when residents complained or asked for itemized expenses, answers were delayed, documents lost, or explanations given in legalese that concealed more than they revealed. It was an empire built on obfuscation. The intimidation tactics were subtle, but relentless. Karen didn't need to scream or threaten. She had perfected a combination of cold glares, pointed comments, and public shaming that made even the most confident resident question their own judgment. One neighbor who dared question her about an expense for buffer zone improvements found herself the subject of a surprise community vote reprimand. Another was accused of violating obscure covenants simply for planting native shrubs too close to the shared sidewalk. Each incident reinforced the message: authority is absolute, and resistance is punished. It was not just the residents who were under her thumb. The HOA staff and even local contractors were complicit in subtle ways. Those who tried to maintain independence were marginalized. Contractors who refused to follow her preferred directives found themselves dropped from the approved list without explanation. Inspectors who questioned her decisions were told their observations were unnecessary or delayed indefinitely. Karen cultivated a culture in which everyone believed compliance was not just expected, but required for personal and professional survival. I studied the organizational charts, the meeting minutes, and the voting records meticulously. Each document revealed layers of favoritism and corruption. Karen had a few key allies who voted in lockstep with her, often without even attending meetings. Proxy votes were common, and the rules around them were manipulated to guarantee outcomes. Residents who tried to intervene were bogged down by procedural hurdles, requests for special meetings denied, appeals lost in paperwork, complaints routed to committees that were stacked with her supporters. It was an unassailable fortress of bureaucracy, unless someone knew exactly where to pry the walls apart. I could feel the tension in the room during each meeting, the silent gasps and clenched jaws of people who knew they had no voice. Karen thrived on this atmosphere. She would call on residents to speak, only to interrupt with sarcasm or dismissive legal jargon. The power she wielded was intoxicating to her. But for someone like me, trained to observe, analyze, and act with precision, her bluster was predictable. Every rule she twisted, every intimidation tactic she used was another thread in the web I could unravel. There was a structural vulnerability, too. While Karen had entrenched herself at the top, the actual system required paper trails, signatures, and approvals that could not simply be fabricated indefinitely. Every contract had to be signed, every invoice processed, every vote documented, and somewhere within those mundane processes, there existed proof, real proof. I just needed to find it. Karen's arrogance was her undoing. She believed that fear and spectacle were sufficient, that no one would ever scrutinize the minutiae. But I could, and I did. The HOA's hidden votes were particularly telling. I began tracking discrepancies between reported outcomes and resident recollections. Every anomaly suggested manipulation. Sometimes it was as simple as a missing signature, other times a vote cast by a member who claimed to have been absent. The patterns weren't obvious at first, but as I mapped them out, the narrative emerged. Karen Fraser had built an unholy alliance, using selective enforcement, proxy votes, and intimidation to consolidate power. And that same structure that gave her control would eventually reveal her crimes. The intimidation escalated when I started asking questions about contractors. Karen's preferred vendors, especially Metobrook Landscaping, were treated differently than the rest. Requests for records were delayed or ignored. Questions about why certain services were being performed on private property met with thinly veiled threats or cryptic references to bylaws that didn't actually authorize the work. It became increasingly clear that Karen was using her position to funnel funds and influence, and that her control over the HOA staff and inspectors had allowed her to act with impunity. Even the residents who supported her were victims in a way. They had been trained to obey, to accept that the system was too complex, too impenetrable to challenge. Fear and loyalty were intertwined, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Karen's power was emotional as much as legal, psychological as much as procedural. Her ability to manipulate perception made her seem invincible. But perception is fragile, and all the manipulation in the world couldn't erase the fact that the law and documentation existed outside her control. Every meeting, every document, every interaction confirmed one thing. This wasn't a casual abuse of power. It was a calculated, methodical exploitation of a system designed to protect the community. Karen Fraser was no mere HOA president. She was an architect of control, an expert in manipulating authority for personal gain. But like all experts who underestimate an opponent, she failed to account for one critical factor. I was watching, analyzing, and waiting. By the time I had mapped out the full power structure, I could see the points of weakness with absolute clarity. Proxy votes, biased inspections, secret approvals, hidden contracts, inflated budgets, all of it had a trail. And more importantly, each piece of evidence was connected to a person, a signature, or a documented event. Karen had built walls around herself, but the foundation beneath those walls was entirely composed of paper, signatures, and emails. One by one, I traced each path, noting where she had overstepped, where legality had been bent or broken. The web of influence she relied on to intimidate others was exactly the web that would trap her. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because understanding Karen Fraser's power isn't just background. It's the reason every move we made next was possible. Her system of control gave her confidence, but it also gave me the blueprint. Every intimidation tactic, every manipulated vote, every favoritism-driven contract became data in the strategy I would deploy. Her arrogance, her belief that no one could stand against her, was about to become the lever that pulled her entire empire apart. In the end, Karen's HOA power structure was both her strength and her undoing. She had created a carefully curated illusion of control, but illusions, no matter how meticulously constructed, crumble under scrutiny. Her reliance on fear, intimidation, and manipulation blinded her to the fact that the law, evidence, and prepared resistance could render her powerless. And that moment was coming. Very soon, every resident, every contractor, and every official who had been manipulated or silenced would witness the unraveling of her meticulously crafted kingdom. It started innocuously enough, with a stack of papers that seemed, on the surface, like nothing more than routine HOA documents, meeting minutes, invoices, contractor agreements, mundane, boring, ordinary. But the first time I thumbed through them, my gut twisted. There was a rhythm here, a pattern I hadn't expected. Numbers that didn't add up, dates that contradicted signatures, and subtle annotations in the margins, almost invisible unless you knew to look. It was as if someone had been sloppy, leaving the breadcrumbs of a scheme laid bare. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because this part of the story isn't about bravado or confrontation, it's about proof. Evidence that could topple a system designed to intimidate and conceal. It was tedious work at first, but I had an advantage: experience in parsing complexity. My background in methodical analysis, coupled with a keen eye for discrepancies, gave me the patience to see what others missed. Each document I examined brought the web of corruption into sharper focus. The first revelation came from the invoices. Metobrook Landscaping, the company Karen had insisted was handling emergency beautification projects, was billing for work that didn't exist. Line items described labor and materials that were never delivered. Costs were inflated, hours multiplied, and some services listed were clearly outside the boundaries of our property. My stomach sank. I realized that if I could connect these invoices to the HOA accounts, I would have more than a suspicion. I would have a paper trail, a proof chain. And proof is far more powerful than anger. Next came the contracts. I discovered that Karen had personally signed off on every major expenditure, often bypassing the normal checks and balances. Some contracts were outright fraudulent, signed under her authority without proper board approval. Others were legal in appearance, but included clauses designed to funnel money to her sister's shell companies. As I traced each one, I could almost hear her voice, smug, confident, believing herself untouchable. But the more I found, the more I understood how her confidence was also a weakness. Sloppy oversight, over-reliance on intimidation, and the assumption that no one would ever scrutinize the paperwork were her undoing. I spent nights cross-referencing HOA bank statements with these contracts. Every check, every deposit, every transfer told a story. There were payments made to companies that didn't exist, amounts that didn't correspond to services rendered, and dates that coincided suspiciously with when residents raised complaints about unauthorized work. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Karen and her allies were operating under a fundamental error. They assumed that no one outside their inner circle would have the patience or the knowledge to piece together the puzzle. They were wrong. Emails became my next treasure trove. Accessing public records and requesting copies of correspondence through formal channels, I started connecting names, dates, and actions. Between Karen, Inspector Morris, and Bill the contractor, a narrative unfolded. It was audacious, organized, and yet astonishingly careless in execution. Emails detailed plans to alter survey markers, manipulate inspections, and expedite permits, all in a way that skirted legality but left a digital paper trail. Reading them, I felt a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The arrogance of these people was staggering. They believed their private communications were invulnerable, that no one would ever see them. I had to be meticulous. I downloaded, cataloged, and time-stamped every document. Contracts were scanned, invoices were logged, emails were printed with metadata intact. Even the smallest attachments were preserved. My system became a fortress of evidence, a digital archive that could not be disputed. I wasn't just collecting proof. I was creating an unassailable narrative of fraud, harassment, and conspiracy. Each new file brought a pang of both excitement and tension. Excitement because I was closer to exposing the scheme. Tension because I knew how dangerous it could be if Karen or her allies suspected I was watching. It wasn't just paperwork, either. I began mapping physical actions against the documentation. Survey stakes moved. Machinery appeared overnight. Trespassing incidents lined up with invoice dates. Even minor acts of intimidation, calls, letters, warnings, were logged meticulously. I created a timeline that spanned months, each entry cross-referenced with supporting evidence. By the time I finished, I could literally say, on this date, this action occurred. Here is the invoice, here is the email, and here is the witness testimony that confirms it. The clarity was intoxicating. Authority was essential in this stage. I consulted municipal codes, county regulations, and HOA bylaws. I learned the exact statutes Karen and Inspector Morris were allegedly exploiting. Every clause they referenced had a counterpoint in law, an obligation they ignored, a responsibility they violated. I printed everything, highlighted sections, and compared the legal language to the actions documented in my archive. Each comparison was another nail in the coffin of their assumed invulnerability. My notes became a precise roadmap, a clear demonstration that their audacious claims of emergency authority were false, legally and ethically. Witness accounts also added depth. I interviewed neighbors discreetly, cross-checked their statements with documented events, and recorded every conversation for reference. One neighbor had seen the bulldozer work being performed in the dead of night. Another had been approached by one of Karen's security contractors, threatened subtly for asking questions about payments. Each testimony, while small in isolation, added texture and weight to the growing case. By layering documentation, emails, invoices, and witness testimony, the scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. Then came the breakthrough. Arthur, the treasurer, the quiet man who had seemed so afraid of Karen, became the linchpin. I reached him carefully, avoiding any confrontation that might spook him. When he finally agreed to meet, the moment was tense, electric. I showed him the drone footage, the invoices, the registration papers linking Metobrook Landscaping to Karen's family. His eyes widened in fear. I didn't threaten him. I simply made him see the cliff they were all standing on. His hesitation became an opportunity. Within 24 hours, a simple, unmarked thumb drive appeared in my mailbox. It was small, unassuming, but it contained the digital evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Every invoice, every contract, every email, all cataloged, organized, and complete. The entire conspiracy lay in my hands. At that moment, adrenaline surged through me. Years of preparation, observation, and careful planning had led to this singular, overwhelming point. I had tangible proof of criminal behavior. I had documentation that could not be ignored or dismissed. And I had a map of the HOA's corruption that could be presented to any legal authority without fear of dismissal. The complexity that Karen had relied on as a shield was now her vulnerability. She had created the maze. I had just found the exit. The technical discovery phase wasn't just about gathering documents. It was about constructing a narrative. Each file, each email, each signed check became a chapter in a story that no one could dispute. I meticulously logged metadata, verified authenticity, and ensured that every piece of evidence could withstand scrutiny. I understood that in a conflict with power and arrogance, precision was as lethal as any confrontation. The law, when respected and harnessed correctly, is unbreakable, and now it was mine to wield. But that wasn't even the half of it. The more I explored, the more I realized how deeply Karen's network of control extended. Environmental permits had been faked, citations manipulated, inspections rigged. Each fraudulent act left a trail, and each trail led directly back to the people orchestrating it. The arrogance of thinking that bureaucracy could conceal criminality was staggering. They had relied on fear, confusion, and complexity to maintain dominance, but their errors were monumental. Every oversight, every inflated number, every misfiled approval became another weapon in my arsenal. By the end of weeks spent in meticulous examination, I had assembled a body of evidence that was not just strong. It was overwhelming. Drone footage corroborated invoices, emails aligned with payments, and witness testimony matched every suspicious action. Every piece of paper, every digital record, every cross-reference painted a portrait of a criminally negligent, fraudulent, and manipulative operation. And at the center of it all, glaringly obvious, was Karen Fraser. The very architect of the scheme, confident in her untouchable power, had left behind the blueprint for her own downfall. It was at that moment I realized something profound. Proof, meticulously gathered and unassailable, is stronger than fear, more powerful than intimidation, and more precise than any confrontation. Evidence has a voice. It speaks without emotion, yet it commands attention. And when combined with patience, careful observation, and a strategic approach, it becomes unstoppable. Karen's empire of control, built on lies and coercion, was now fully exposed to me. Every detail, every signature, every act of fraud laid bare. The discovery of the evidence was exhilarating, but I knew the hard part was just beginning. Gathering proof was one thing. Confronting the perpetrators was another entirely. Karen Fraser, the self-styled queen of Granderson Estates, wasn't going to crumble quietly. She thrived on control, intimidation, and fear. And now, armed with irrefutable evidence, I had to navigate a minefield where one wrong move could trigger a devastating backlash. I felt the familiar twinge of adrenaline, the mix of fear and determination that always precedes a confrontation with someone who believes themselves untouchable. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because what happened next isn't something you see every day. This wasn't a casual disagreement or a neighborly spat. This was a deliberate, systematic attempt to terrorize and manipulate a homeowner, and now it was my turn to respond. I began with careful observation. Every day, I monitored Karen's movements, her routines, and the people she brought into my neighborhood under the guise of official HOA business. She was audacious, unafraid of the law, or so she thought, and I needed to be several steps ahead at all times. The first real escalation came quickly. A notice appeared on my front door, typed in a sharp, official font, claiming that my property was in violation of an emergency environmental ordinance. The letter was unsigned, vaguely threatening, and cited statutes that didn't exist. My blood boiled, but I stayed calm. Emotional control was critical. I documented the notice, scanned it, and added it to my growing archive. The pattern was clear. Karen was attempting to intimidate me into compliance through bureaucratic manipulation. But I had a better weapon than fear. Proof. I responded methodically. Every time a new letter, email, or contractor visit appeared, I logged it. Photographs, time-stamped videos, and witness accounts filled my files. The tension grew, escalating with each incident. First, it was a landscaping crew arriving without notice, attempting to clear brush along my property line. They were met with a polite but firm refusal and a warning that the police had been notified. Then came the more brazen actions. Survey stakes moved overnight, small machines trespassing on my land, and passive-aggressive notes left by HOA representatives. Each act was calculated to test my patience, to see if I would react rashly. I didn't. The public dimension added fuel to the fire. Word of the conflict began to leak to neighbors, some supportive, others fearful. Karen tried to frame me as the unreasonable homeowner, the troublemaker disrupting the community peace. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, emails circulated, and hushed conversations at HOA meetings painted me as the enemy. But rather than falter, I leaned into transparency. I began documenting these attacks with precision. Every action, every false claim, and every attempted intimidation became part of the story. The emotional escalation was palpable, but I controlled the narrative. Then came the first legal strike. I had already engaged a lawyer, Peterson, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who specialized in property disputes and municipal corruption. We approached the matter carefully, presenting the initial evidence of invoices, fraudulent contracts, and unauthorized work. Our first move was a formal complaint to the county, highlighting the illegitimacy of the emergency orders and the pattern of harassment. The response from county officials was cautious, but engaged. They opened preliminary inquiries, sending inspectors to verify claims. That small acknowledgement of authority was enough to unsettle Karen. though she masked it behind her usual veneer of arrogance. But Karen wasn't one to retreat quietly. Her next escalation was personal. Anonymous calls at odd hours, letters threatening fines, and subtle messages through neighbors began to test the limits of my patience. She relied on intimidation to erode resolve, hoping I would make a mistake. I didn't. Instead, I escalated my documentation, ensuring that every call, every letter, and every interaction was logged, time-stamped, and backed up. The emotional tension was intense, but I stayed focused on control and strategy. I was no longer reacting to the harassment. I was building a case, a fortress of evidence that could not be breached. The public encounters intensified the pressure. At HOA meetings, Karen wielded influence like a weapon. She attempted to publicly shame me, questioning my credibility and painting me as a disruptor of community harmony. I attended these meetings silently at first, listening, observing, and gathering every word, every gesture, and every display of bias or manipulation. It became clear that the board was complicit, either through fear or loyalty, in supporting her agenda. That complicity would later prove pivotal. During this period, the intimidation became physical in nature. A bulldozer, the same one I had seen in reconnaissance, appeared at the edge of my property. Headlights cut through the night as a large truck and heavy machinery rumbled toward my woods. The audacity was staggering. They believed that brute force could substitute for legality. I didn't panic. I activated my surveillance system, called 911, and prepared to confront the situation with calm authority. The floodlights illuminated the property, the machines, and the hired security in black jackets with private security stenciled across their backs. I stood firm, documenting everything. The first police response was cautious but immediate. Officers arrived swiftly, assessing the situation with professional precision. The private security team attempted to assert control, claiming this was a civil matter. The sergeant, unflinching and firm, identified the criminal nature of the trespass and intimidation. The men were detained, their bluff exposed. The bulldozer operator, faced with the law, shut down the engine and raised his hands. It was a moment of triumph, not just for me, but for the principle that evidence and law triumph over arrogance and force. But that was only the beginning. Karen's panic was palpable. She called, her voice a mixture of fury and desperation, inadvertently confirming her collusion with Inspector Morris and the contractor. That phone call, recorded with legal precision, became another unassailable piece of evidence. Every subsequent move she made was documented, every legal violation logged, and every attempt at further intimidation catalogued. The emotional pressure she attempted to exert only reinforced my resolve. I was no longer fighting blindly. I was strategically dismantling her power. Throughout this escalation, I engaged additional authorities, ensuring redundancy and accountability. The County Sheriff's Department, the HOA Board, after a restructuring of loyalists, and my legal counsel were all looped in. Chain of custody for every piece of evidence was maintained, emails and recordings backed up in multiple locations, and witnesses formally documented. Each act of harassment became a legal lever, each attempt at fear a step closer to accountability. Karen and her allies were operating under the assumption that chaos could be used to intimidate, but chaos, when meticulously recorded, becomes evidence. The emotional chain during this period was intense. Violation, fury, control, revenge, and justice interwove constantly. Each night, I reviewed footage of trespassing, emails, and recorded calls. Each incident fueled both my determination and my strategic approach. The HOA's arrogance was being systematically undone by methodical evidence collection and legal precision. Every time they believed they had gained the upper hand, the next layer of proof exposed their misdeeds, making the stakes higher and their position more untenable. Public outrage became another pressure point. Neighbors, now fully aware of Karen's manipulations, rallied in support. Meetings were no longer forums for intimidation. They became platforms where documentation was presented, patterns of corruption outlined, and accountability demanded. Karen's allies, who had once been silent, began to distance themselves as the evidence became undeniable. The social and emotional isolation added to the legal pressure, creating a multidimensional confrontation that she could neither intimidate nor escape. By the end of the confrontation escalation, Karen's position was irreversibly compromised. The HOA's influence, built on fear, coercion, and manipulation, had collapsed under the weight of documented proof, legal oversight, and public scrutiny. What began as intimidation escalated into a full-scale unraveling of her authority, each act of harassment and each legal misstep meticulously catalogued and leveraged. I had transformed from a targeted homeowner into a strategic force, using evidence, law, and controlled response to dismantle an empire of arrogance. Every incident, every attempted power play, every midnight intrusion, and every falsified document became a brick in the foundation of their downfall. The culmination of these confrontations set the stage for the expert retaliation that would ultimately end Karen's reign and restore both justice and peace. The lessons were clear. Meticulous documentation, calm authority, and relentless pursuit of truth can overcome even the most audacious abuse of power. The stage was set for the final act, and I was fully prepared to play it with precision. With the confrontation phase behind me, the path forward was clear. Expert retaliation. The evidence I had meticulously gathered was powerful, but raw power alone would not topple someone as arrogant and cunning as Karen Fraser. To truly dismantle her network, I needed every resource, every professional authority, and every legal mechanism available. I began by coordinating with Peterson, my lawyer, whose calm precision was a perfect counterbalance to the chaos Karen had tried to unleash. His first directive was simple, yet profound. Let the law become the hammer, and evidence the chisel. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because this next part changes everything. I started with the agencies, filing formal complaints against both Karen and her accomplices. The county inspector, Morris, had overstepped every boundary imaginable, abusing his position for personal gain. Peterson drafted a comprehensive complaint detailing each violation: falsified emergency orders, unauthorized property access, coordination with a phantom landscaping company, and financial manipulation of HOA funds. Every accusation was paired with hard evidence: emails, contracts, drone footage, and recorded phone calls. The weight of the documentation made it impossible to ignore. We also involved the state's regulatory bodies. A call to the department overseeing licensed contractors revealed that Bill, the so-called professional behind Metobrook Landscaping, had no valid license for the type of work he claimed to perform. That added another layer of criminality. Not only was this company a shell, but it had knowingly misrepresented its qualifications to conduct hazardous work. Peterson moved swiftly, preparing filings that exposed the full depth of the conspiracy. The combination of local law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and a solid legal strategy created a network of accountability that Karen and her allies could not penetrate or corrupt. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was beginning to fracture. Residents, once fearful of Karen's control, were emboldened by the mounting evidence. Board members who had quietly tolerated her abuses started asking questions, demanding transparency, and in some cases, confessing that they had been pressured or misled. We held strategy sessions with residents willing to testify or provide corroborating information. Each meeting built momentum. Karen had underestimated the power of transparency, and now it was her turn to feel the isolation of exposure. The harassment that had once been relentless was now redirected into legal pressure. Peterson and I coordinated the filing of civil suits for trespass, fraud, and conspiracy. Every invoice, every manipulated document, every falsified order became a bullet in our arsenal. I watched as Karen's confidence faltered, first in subtle ways, hesitations in meetings, terse responses to correspondence, and then more overtly as she realized that the walls she had built around herself were crumbling. The tide of control had shifted, and the once powerful HOA queen was now on the defensive. One of the most satisfying moments came when we presented the compiled evidence to the county sheriff's office. I sat across from the sergeant, Peterson at my side, and watched as the timeline of events unfolded on a large monitor. The look on the sheriff's face was unmistakable. This wasn't a minor civil dispute. This was a coordinated, fraudulent operation, using both the authority of the HOA and the complicity of a county inspector to intimidate and manipulate. Officers took immediate action, reviewing their options and preparing warrants that would make Karen and her network accountable under the full weight of the law. But here's where everything blew apart. Karen, sensing that her empire was under siege, made a fatal error. She attempted to hide documents, delete emails, and obscure the financial trail. Each attempt was meticulously documented by the forensic team Peterson brought in. They recovered deleted files, traced digital footprints, and even located backups Karen had believed were hidden. The evidence not only remained intact, it multiplied, each piece reinforcing the previous, creating an airtight case that no courtroom defense could undermine. We didn't stop with the HOA or the inspector. Peterson identified regulatory violations with potential criminal implications, filing complaints with the state licensing boards, environmental protection agencies, and financial oversight committees. Each filing was a strategic strike, a calculated move that left Karen increasingly isolated and under scrutiny from multiple directions. Her network of intimidation had no counterweight. They thought fear would protect them. Instead, fear became a magnet, drawing the attention of every agency capable of enforcing accountability. The emotional impact was almost intoxicating. Every call confirming receipt of documents, every email acknowledging a formal investigation, every phone conversation with agency officials added fuel to my sense of control. I felt the shift in power as Karen's arrogance met the cold precision of legal authority. There was fury, yes, but it was tempered by discipline. I wasn't seeking revenge in chaos. I was orchestrating justice in slow, inevitable increments. Each procedural step, each document submitted, and each witness statement brought satisfaction and reinforced the inevitability of their downfall. Even Karen's public maneuvers failed spectacularly. She attempted to sway neighbors with misrepresentations, claiming I was disrupting the community and overreacting. But by this stage, the evidence was not just overwhelming, it was visible. Drone footage showed the trespassing, invoices exposed financial fraud, and the recorded calls laid bare collusion. The community's perception shifted decisively. Those who had once hesitated now supported the legal process. Word spread quickly, turning what Karen thought was a private struggle into a matter of public accountability. Each step of expert retaliation was calculated for psychological impact as well. Karen believed that control meant dominance. I demonstrated that knowledge and legal authority were more potent than brute force. Every filing, every call, and every agency report was a reminder that actions have consequences. The emotional escalation was continuous. Violation, fury, control, revenge, justice. Each element fed the next. The trolls, the security guards, the phony contractors, None could escape the net that had been meticulously woven over months of planning and execution. Peterson also ensured redundancy. Copies of all evidence went to multiple secure locations, with clear chains of custody and timestamps. Every phone call, every document, every surveillance recording was cataloged. This not only prevented any possibility of destruction or manipulation, but also communicated a silent message to Karen and her collaborators. There was no escape. The fortress of accountability was complete. By the end of this phase, the system had fully collapsed around Karen Fraser. The HOA's corrupt practices, once hidden behind bureaucracy and intimidation, were exposed in full. Inspector Morris faced disciplinary action and criminal investigation. Bill the contractor faced licensing and fraud charges, and Metobrook Landscaping's fraudulent operations were dissolved. Each action demonstrated that no one is above the law, no matter how secure. They feel behind titles, offices, or perceived authority. As I watched these processes unfold, I realized the true power of expert retaliation. It combined knowledge, documentation, legal precision, and strategic patience. Karen's attempts to maintain dominance crumbled not through confrontation or brute strength, but through careful orchestration of authority. The triumph was not just personal. It was a victory for the principle that evidence-backed, legally sanctioned action can dismantle even the most entrenched abuse of power. Every meeting, every filing, and every interaction with agencies reinforced the narrative. Karen and her cohorts were increasingly isolated, defensive, and visibly panicked. She tried once more to influence the community, to sway neighbors, to present herself as a victim. But the story had changed. The public record, the legal documentation, and the overwhelming evidence made her attempts laughably ineffective. Her network of intimidation was broken, replaced with accountability, transparency, and oversight. Finally, after months of careful orchestration, I felt the surge of triumph that comes from seeing justice unfold not through luck, but through discipline, evidence, and relentless strategy. The experts had done their work, the agencies had done theirs, and Karen Fraser, once untouchable in her HOA fortress, was now exposed, powerless, and facing the full consequences of her actions. Every phone call, every document, and every piece of evidence had led to this point, a systematic, undeniable dismantling of her reign. The emotional arc was complete. From the initial violation of my property and trust, through the fury of harassment, the exercise of control and strategic retaliation, and finally the orchestration of justice through legal and regulatory channels, every moment reinforced the lesson. Knowledge, preparation, and strategic use of authority are more potent than fear, force, or arrogance. I had turned the tables entirely. Karen Fraser, the manipulative HOA queen, had been unmasked, humiliated, and legally neutralized. The system itself, once exploited to shield her, had become the instrument of her undoing. By the time the legal filings were finalized and the agencies completed their reviews, it was clear nothing Karen could do would change the outcome. Her credibility, her power, and her network of control had been systematically dismantled. I watched, with controlled satisfaction, as the consequences of her actions became unavoidable. Every fraudulent document, every manipulated invoice, every collusive act of intimidation was accounted for, each reinforcing the certainty of accountability. Expert retaliation, I realized, is not reactive. It is proactive, precise, and relentless. It transforms vulnerability into control, chaos into order, and fear into justice. The meticulous orchestration of authority, combined with legal rigor and community support, had achieved what raw force never could. Complete dismantling of a corrupt system from within. The stage was now set for the final chapter. the total victory that would end Karen Fraser's reign and restore both my property and my peace of mind. The final act of this saga arrived not with a roar, but with a quiet, undeniable authority. After months of careful preparation, legal maneuvering, and the relentless accumulation of evidence, the moment to claim total victory had finally arrived. The courthouse was gray that morning, overcast clouds casting a flat light across the polished marble steps. Yet I felt an electric sense of anticipation. Diane and I walked together, each step deliberate, knowing that this was the culmination of every sleepless night, every tense confrontation, and every painstaking effort to preserve the integrity of our property and our peace of mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen Fraser, who had once dictated the rules of our little suburban world with an air of untouchable power, would now be standing where I had once been most vulnerable, under the scrutiny of the law she thought she could manipulate. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because what happens next isn't just justice, it's a masterclass in accountability. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was measured, the kind of restrained tension that masks the storm beneath. Karen entered first, dressed not in her usual pastel power suit, but in a muted gray ensemble that somehow emphasized her smallness. There was no entourage, no smug smile, no aura of control. She walked with an awkward grace, her eyes darting to the rows of evidence displayed before the judge, the courtroom staff, and the gallery. Every glance betrayed her realization. She was exposed, and the walls she had built around herself, the fortress of intimidation and deceit, had crumbled. The proceedings moved with deliberate pace. Peterson, calm and authoritative, presented the case with methodical clarity. The thumb drive, the emails, the invoices, and the drone footage were laid out systematically, each piece of evidence reinforcing the next. The judge listened attentively, occasionally raising an eyebrow at a particularly blatant act of fraud or collusion. Inspector Morris's recorded call was played in full. Karen's own panicked phone calls, where she inadvertently admitted to the conspiracy, were introduced as part of the record. Every misstep, every lie, every attempt at manipulation had been captured, catalogued, and presented with irrefutable precision. I watched Karen shift in her seat as the weight of the evidence bore down. Her face paled in stages, from faint concern to stark realization, and finally to outright defeat. For a moment, I allowed myself a private smile, subtle, restrained, but it carried the satisfaction of knowing that the law, combined with careful planning and unassailable proof, had triumphed over arrogance and deceit. Diane squeezed my hand under the bench, a silent acknowledgement of the long journey that had led us here. The judge began the sentencing. His voice was steady, authoritative, and completely unswayed by the theatrics Karen had once relied upon. The fines were substantial, far beyond mere punishment. They were a reckoning. Every penny funneled through Metobrook Landscaping to her sister's shell company would be repaid. Restitution was ordered to the HOA, not as a gesture of charity, but as a rectification of the corruption she had engineered. The lifetime ban from serving on any HOA or similar board was a masterstroke, a permanent safeguard against the kind of power she had once wielded with impunity. Karen's expression, once so composed and self-assured, now registered a resigned despair. The realization that her influence had evaporated, her empire dismantled, and her reputation permanently tarnished, settled over her like a heavy cloak. Inspector Morris faced consequences that mirrored his own role in the conspiracy. Terminated from his county position, stripped of his license, and subjected to fines for corruption, he could no longer hide behind the veneer of authority he had once abused. Bill the contractor, along with his security operatives, received probation and community service, their reputations and livelihoods permanently altered by their association with a fraudulent scheme. Metobrook Landscaping, a company that had existed only as a vehicle for deceit, was dissolved entirely, leaving no trace of the phantom operation that had terrorized our property and our lives. The emotional release of witnessing this justice was profound. There was triumph, yes, but it was tempered by reflection. The fight had been exhausting, mentally and emotionally, and yet every strategy, every legal maneuver, and every calculated move had been necessary to ensure the outcome was unassailable. It was not merely revenge, it was restoration. Restoration of order, of property rights, and of the community's trust. Every action taken by Karen and her accomplices had consequences, and the law had ensured that those consequences were absolute. One of the most satisfying aspects of the total victory was the restoration of the land itself. The HOA, now under new, humble leadership, was ordered to fund a full ecological restoration along the creek and the disturbed buffer zone. I spent hours reviewing bids from environmental engineering firms, each presentation more promising than the last. Ultimately, we selected a company specializing in native plant restoration, capable of rebuilding the delicate ecosystem that had been damaged by Karen's reckless ambitions. Watching the first crews arrive, planting ferns and river birches, felt like the physical embodiment of justice, proof that restoration could extend beyond legal victories and into the natural world that Karen had once trampled upon. As the days turned into weeks, the community began to shift. Residents, who had previously feared the consequences of opposing Karen, now approached with renewed confidence. They offered congratulations, shared stories of quiet defiance, and expressed relief that transparency had been restored. The HOA's culture, once toxic and manipulative, had been fundamentally altered. The board itself, now accountable and transparent, consulted with us on ongoing matters affecting our property and the surrounding land. It was a transformation that extended beyond my personal victory. It was a systemic correction that would protect the community from future abuse. There was a poetic satisfaction in the quiet moments that followed. Standing on the back deck, the floodlights no longer necessary, I felt a sense of serenity that had been absent for months. The only illumination was the soft glow of the moon filtering through the leaves, the gentle whisper of the creek, and the chirping of frogs in the newly restored buffer zone. My property, my boundaries, and my peace had been defended, not through force or intimidation, but through discipline, knowledge, and the precise application of authority. The violation I had endured had transformed into a demonstration of control and justice, a lesson that even the most powerful bullies are constrained by the evidence-backed rule of law. Before we go any further, comment below. Where are you watching from right now? Because the lesson here extends far beyond my backyard. Drawing a line, defending it with calm determination, and engaging every available system of accountability is a universal principle. Bullies, manipulators, and corrupt authorities operate on the assumption that silence or inaction will protect them. When met with prepared, disciplined resistance, their power collapses. Karen Fraser's downfall was inevitable the moment the first piece of evidence was documented and the first call to an agency was made. Months later, as the restoration work continued, I received a small welcome basket and handwritten apology from the new HOA board. It was a gesture, yes, but it symbolized more than civility. It represented the acknowledgement that power must be checked and transparency must be maintained. The ecosystem along the creek was healing. The fence marking the boundary of my property was stronger than ever, and the knowledge that every potential threat had been neutralized gave a profound sense of freedom. The line on the map, once theoretical, had become a living boundary enforced by law, restoration, and vigilance. Reflecting on the journey, the emotional arc is clear. Initial violation sparked fury, which was tempered into strategic control, culminating in methodical revenge and absolute justice. Every step required patience, attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to principle. The law was not merely a tool, it was the ultimate instrument of empowerment when wielded with expertise and precision. Karen Fraser's hubris had been her undoing. Every attempt to manipulate, intimidate, and conceal had been neutralized by careful planning, evidence, and authoritative action. The final outcome was both satisfying and instructive, demonstrating that even the most seemingly untouchable individuals can be held accountable. Standing on that back deck, observing the restored buffer zone, listening to the wind and the frogs, I understood the deeper lesson. Proof, when meticulously gathered and strategically deployed, is stronger than power. Calm defense, executed with precision, can render arrogance impotent, and a clear line, drawn, defended, and respected, creates not only physical boundaries, but moral and legal clarity. Karen Fraser's empire had been dismantled, her authority nullified, and her community restored. The quiet triumph, the restoration of order, and the validation of principle were victories far beyond the courtroom. A total victory in every sense of the word. The moral payoff was unmistakable. Those who attempt to manipulate, intimidate, or corrupt the system will ultimately face the consequences. But those who prepare, document, and act with strategic authority can convert violation into triumph, fury into justice, and threat into empowerment. Karen Fraser had been unmasked, humiliated, and permanently constrained. The HOA's toxic influence had been eradicated, and for the first time in months, peace reigned, not imposed by fear, but established by clarity, evidence, and the unwavering commitment to what was right. As night fell, I stood silently on the deck one last time, the restored creek glistening under the moonlight. Every element, the fence, the plants, the wildlife, served as a testament to persistence, preparation, and the power of legal and moral authority. The total victory was complete, but more than that, it was a living lesson. Clarity, discipline, and unwavering adherence to principle can conquer even the most manipulative, arrogant forces. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the most absolute, echoing not just in the courtroom or the HOA records, but in the gentle rhythm of restored life all around us.